今度のスタジオを建てる時にも3階建てなんですけどね、会社が反映したってしょうがないんですよね。それよりもそこにいる人間たちがちゃんと自分のやりたいことと面白い映画を作ろうっていうことが最大の目的で。
One consistent theme in my work is to watch good animation and surpass it. That was a quote from Hayao Miyazaki in 1978, and ever since then he's developed a filmography compiled of some of the greatest animated masterpieces in cinematic history. For 40 years, Miyazaki's dexterity and creativity has dazzled audiences through his feature-length animations, to become the undisputed master of his craft. Only those whose names have become synonymous with the medium could profess to a career as consistently successful and celebrated as his. But how's Miyazaki maintained not only critical acclaim, but a far-reaching audience? Unlike his native land, in the West there still remains a stigma that most animation is solely for children, and thus animation that's created typically tends to avoid the more burdensome themes we're accustomed to in our live-action films. However, Miyazaki is not your typical animator. He took an approach to animated filmmaking that concentrates on the emotional intricacies of his subjects, as opposed to creating, ironically, cartoony characters. His aim wasn't to make things that spoke down to children, his aim was to make films that would help us all further understand the human condition. Movies such as The Curious Adventures of Mr. Wonderbird and Hakujiden were Miyazaki's inspirations for how he would approach animation, always admiring the early works of Disney for their technical abilities, but thought their emotional depictions were far too simplistic. Early days of animation could get away with being somewhat shallow, but Miyazaki sought to change that, famously hating the prescribed label of the Japanese Disney. A more appropriate title would be a Japanese Yuri Norstein, as Miyazaki's animations aren't about their external flair, but their internal subtleties. He stated numerous times that the film The Snow Queen showed him animation's potential in its depiction of human emotion. These influences are what form the filmmaker we have today, setting him apart from his contemporaries. A combination of skill and proficiency of Western animators with an approach of Eastern sensibility. Because Miyazaki's foundations for his films are found through empathy and reality. Empathy captured by the audience self-projection on the characters, and reality through the honest depiction of the unpredictability of people's lives. Above everything, if we wanted to know what makes a Miyazaki film, then all we need to look at is the emotional element.
そしたらそのプロデューサー室のあれですね、子供は分からなくても分からないものに出会うことが必要で、そのうちに分かるようになるんだってなことを言ってくれたんで、そういう考え方もあるなと。
Miyazaki has stated that at the core of all his stories, there must be a sense of realism. Amidst the gods, demons and fantasy elements, it's the human side that's always prioritised. His focus often lies on human nature, and what can be understood irrespective of culture, characters that are fully fleshed out with clear goals. The starting point of any character is to understand what it is they want.
Don't you worry, I promise I'll get you out of here soon, just don't get any fatter or they'll eat you!
Make it clear what your character wants to achieve, otherwise they'll have no obstacles to overcome. Keep it simple. Lupin wants to save Lady Clarice. That's all we need. You've got an objective, but none of it matters if your characters have no three-dimensionality. Miyazaki begins the humanization of his characters through the purely visual means of character movement. Beginning his career as a manga artist, he was influenced by a style known as gekiga, a form of manga akin to more serious storytelling and as a result more realistic drawings. See, Miyazaki has serious problems with the anime industry, and he's spoken openly about his distaste for its often cheap tactics of achieving audience reaction through the over-expressionism of its characters. And so he tends not to focus on the large flashy movements in his animations, but the more subdued subtle ones. The characters he presents to us come with familiar idiosyncrasies, whether it's someone walking on their knees to avoid treading on a carpet, or a little girl tapping her shoes to ensure they're on correctly. It's actions like these that enrich the characters of Miyazaki, as it often can be something as simple as the minutiae of an action that can emphasise who that character is. His characters can be extremely expressive at times, and the quality of the animation most definitely helps this, but for the more indistinct actions, we see characters who don't have to think about what it is they're doing, and so we get a chance to see characters essentially at their most primal. Spend time on arbitrary actions, and it shows us how that character thinks through how they approach things. Are they careful and precise, or clumsy and stubborn? Small details at such a precise degree is what make Miyazaki characters feel human, because we recognise the basic tasks they perform that other filmmakers wouldn't include, and we gain emotional insight to a character when they're at their most recognisable. But the reason Miyazaki is able to capture the nature of people so well is because above all else, he understands people.
She's kind of a lazy bum, which is exactly the way that my favorite 10-year-old girls are. You lazy bum, I want to tell them, but I know their inner resources are as rich as Chihiro's.
Miyazaki studies people, and his comprehension of human behaviour is displayed through the plethora of actions within his characters. He never reuses the same expression, even with something as basic as running. His character actions have innumerable variations, as their behaviours are drawn through what the character feels at that moment. Is a character fearful, mournful, or filled with joy? Any emotion can be displayed in not what your character does, but how they do it. With the implementation of this technique, the character never loses their vitality. Miyazaki's animation should be watched from the perspective of our own lives, because his goal is for us to understand ourselves better through the people of his stories. The truthfulness of his characters is how this is achieved. A character like Mei is single-minded, and Kiki can be rude, but character imperfections are necessary for realism. Audiences can't identify with someone that's been written to be perfect. We need some commonalities, and character shortcomings are a requisite for this. Nobody's perfect, and Miyazaki enforces a vital rule when making any character. Just because they're the protagonist, it doesn't make them infallible. It's another example of how Miyazaki gets us to realise our familiarities with the characters. Who doesn't remember clutching something close when you were nervous, or holding grudges because of a jealous tiff? Nostalgia is prevalent in a Miyazaki animation, with characters often being representations of something we discarded in growing up. That feeling of yearning for a time past is experienced by all of us. However, in a Miyazaki film, we use a surrogate for this emotion and enjoy a world of unique experiences. By having his characters magnify the elements of ourselves that we recognise the most, and present it to us in such a realistic manner, these characters become humanised. And humanising is the way Miyazaki develops an empathic bond between the audience and his films.
それから本当に心に穴が開いてしまった悪役を出すと映画全体が本当にすさんだものになりますから、それはやっぱり描きたくないんですね。アニメーターが仕事やってる時見ると、こう笑顔を描いてる時は笑顔になってるんです。それから悪役を描いてる時は大抵嫌な顔して描いてますから、なるべく笑顔の方が長い方が映画としてはいいんじゃないか。
Miyazaki's attention to the subtleties of people displays a complexity, one that's present throughout the entirety of his worlds. It's interesting to see a filmmaker's philosophies permeate their filmmaking to such a degree as Miyazaki's have, but his process involves capturing what he sees in humanity, so really it shouldn't come as such a surprise that the themes of his films are often based around his social and spiritual beliefs. One theme often presented is the idea of animism, the notion of a spiritual kind of connection within all of nature. Although Miyazaki believes people to be a part of nature, and so they're incorporated into this connection too. By doing so, in a Miyazaki world, everything we see reflects the same traits that humans possess. Unlike traditional fantasy, Miyazaki doesn't portray morality as a simple binary. The dichotomy of good versus evil isn't present in these films. Everything and everyone displays elements of tenderness as well as elements of savagery. Nothing in the world is simply one or the other, it's an amalgamation of all emotions within the spectrum. The same way Lady Eboshi wants to destroy the forest, yet at the same time houses the sick and gives the inhabitants of Irontown a good lifestyle, Miyazaki proposes a theme of morality that's complex. It's not shown to repress the negative aspects of humanity, because they exist all around us. It's part of nature. Brutality and tenderness coexist without any contradictions in these worlds as they do in our own. This realism avoids pandering to an audience to give an unflinching view of our own existence. But the message we see is that the story is never about the protagonist winning. It's about the protagonist adapting and growing to a world that isn't built around their needs. We're confronted with harsh realities, however they're addressed so that something better may arise. Many animations end with everything tied in a neat bow, saved by a deus ex machina that solved everything, but there hasn't really been any development of the character. They achieve their goal without overcoming any long-lasting personal obstacles. On the other hand, Miyazaki characters never end as the audience expected. They begin flawed and remain flawed, but their experiences have helped blossom their outlook. Ashitaka's scar may still remain, and no one may ever understand or believe Chihiro. But the solidarity and connection they've made with their world is an example of a spiritual liberation of the character, instead of a material one. Remember how earlier I said you should always know what it is your character wants? Well, by the end of a Miyazaki film, a distinction is made between what it is the character wants and what the character needs. Sometimes the goal of your film should be where you want your character to end on an emotional level. Because even though our characters have clear goals, those goals are never as important as the characters themselves.
アニメーションっていうのは、意志が筋肉なんですよ。意志を表現、運命を表現する、意志を表現するんです。
Moments like this emphasize the priority of Miyazaki's human elements rather than the fantasy. And I think it's important to take into account Miyazaki's attitude to filmmaking, because a lot of this can simply be credited to the film's production. Miyazaki never studied screenwriting, and to this day he leaves a lot up to feelings and intuition. It's a very interesting approach to filmmaking, because while the film's being made, the scripts and storyboards are simultaneously worked on. What effect does this have? Well, because no one knows how the story will end, it's never made the primary focus. Instead, many scenes are planned out individually, not as story threads, but simply as methods of conveying emotion. It's a technique wherein if all we saw was the one scene, we would understand all of the emotional information that was there. To achieve this, Miyazaki simply continues to draw settings that evoke feelings. He's never concerned about plot in the early stages. Emotion is the key, and it's important to instill this in the audience before anything else. The reason as to why his films create atmospheres so well is because the imagery takes precedence, continually altering them during pre-production with no other objective than to have them make us feel something. The impression of a landscape is dependent on the emotions of the person viewing the landscape. By displaying the world through the emotional perspective of the character, the world can reflect this emotion back. He rarely uses flat landscapes. His settings are typically in valleys, coves, or even the sky. Human sensibilities are often connected to the weather. All of these meticulous details are what fill the screen. And so when we wonder why Miyazaki films feel that bit bigger, that little bit calmer, it's because Miyazaki has taken the time to find the best way to replicate whatever mood the character emits through his worlds. Sentiment is what seeps from the pores of a Miyazaki film. Even the pacing is used in such a way to heighten the response of the audience. The fact that Miyazaki uses many high-octane moments, it requires the slower ones in order to let the emotion have time to sink in. Western animation seems to be the antithesis of this, very rarely slowing down the action, and almost never having the quiet moments that Miyazaki seems to often utilise. See, I often find silence and stillness to be the reflective moments of cinema. Periods in which your audience shares a moment with your character simply to figure out their situation, or perhaps in turn, project their own feelings onto the character. Miyazaki will often let time slowly pass by for our characters, in the hope that the connection we've made with them is what speaks at that moment. We may wait at a bus stop, or we may travel along a silent train journey. But through the minds of our characters, we've related. It doesn't need to be explained. We know exactly what they're thinking. With worlds as alien and obscure as Miyazaki's, there's bound to be some elements that are left to our interpretation. But the thing is, we don't have to understand everything. Miyazaki's principle is emotion, not logic, and so a lot of his design of the fantasy aspect isn't explained. The reason for this is because an object is likelier to attract our interest when we can't explain it. The creatures that Miyazaki creates are often ambiguous in their actions. We don't know what they're thinking. The more that thing is anthropomorphized, the more we're able to empathize, but the less intriguing it becomes. Miyazaki reserves empathy for his human elements and mystery for his fantasy elements. Sometimes it's better not to offer explanations, because giving a reason doesn't clarify the problem.
ああいう時って喋らなくなるんですよ。その後エンディングで一緒にいるじゃない。あそこで喋ったら変だよ。あそこ喋んなかったですね。ちゃんと来たよねだって。
Miyazaki once said, "If I were asked to give my view of what animation is, I would say it's whatever I want to make." Gods and spirits may be the surface of his films, but at the heart are stories about people, about feelings that help us grow and change. His environments may be disjointed at first glance, but his use of modern elements gives us something to recognise. And it's his implementation of traditional Japanese design that gives the world a mystery, yet a consistency. It all comes down to empathy with people and reality of the world. In the end, Miyazaki offers a sense of liberation to his characters, and in turn, does so to us. We see people in a suffocating society, but ultimately show characters that become self-reliant, not through a tangible achievement, but an emotional one. Miyazaki has mastered a level of emotional filmmaking rivaled by few other filmmakers, where perhaps there is ambiguity throughout his works, and maybe it does ask suspension of disbelief from the audience, but when it's removed from the world of logic and clinical analysis, the films make perfect sense, because no filmmaker understands the essence of humanity better than Hayao Miyazaki.
"その向こうでき